The explosive device detonated at 2:17 a.m. on November 8, 2023, completely destroying the two-story farmhouse on Riverside Road in Millfield, Oregon. The blast was so powerful that debris scattered across a quarter-mile radius, with fragments of wood, metal, and concrete found in neighboring properties. Emergency responders arrived to find a crater where the house once stood, with flames still burning in the wreckage. Inside the destroyed structure, investigators would discover the remains of 7 people, 24-year-old Victoria Harmon and 6 men ranging in age from 28 to 45. Each victim had been bound with zip ties before the explosion, and forensic analysis would later reveal that all 7 had been alive when the bomb detonated. The killer had wanted them to know what was coming. The perpetrator had left no doubt about his identity or his motives. A handwritten note was found pinned to a tree 200 yards from the explosion site, protected in a waterproof container. The message read, "My daughter chose degeneracy over family. I have cleansed this poison from our community. Frank Harmon, father and protector." The note was dated 3 days before the explosion occurred. Frank Harmon, 52, had discovered that his daughter Victoria was living in a polyamorous relationship with 6 men in what they called their chosen family. The arrangement had been ongoing for 18 months, with all 7 adults cohabiting in the remote farmhouse that Victoria had purchased with money from her trust fund. Frank had learned about the living situation just 2 weeks before the explosion, when a private investigator he hired provided him with detailed surveillance footage and photographs. What made this case particularly disturbing was the methodical nature of Frank's planning. Evidence found in his own home revealed that he had been constructing the explosive device for 10 days, using materials purchased from multiple hardware stores across 3 counties. He had also been conducting surveillance on the farmhouse, documenting the daily routines of all 7 residents and identifying the optimal time for his attack. The explosion had been timed to occur when all 7 residents were asleep, ensuring maximum casualties and minimal chance of escape. Frank had disabled the house's electrical system hours before the blast, cutting power to security cameras and preventing any emergency calls. He had planned every detail to guarantee that his daughter and her partners would die together in what he viewed as divine retribution for their unconventional lifestyle. Millfield, Oregon, was a rural farming community of 3,200 residents nestled in the Cascade foothills, where conservative values and traditional family structures had remained largely unchanged for generations. The town was built around agriculture and timber, with most families having lived in the area for decades. Churches outnumbered bars 3 to 1, and community events centered around harvest festivals and high school football games. Frank Harmon had been a respected member of the community for over 20 years, working as a farm equipment mechanic and serving on the town council. He was known for his strong work ethic, his devotion to his late wife Margaret, and his rigid adherence to traditional Christian values. Frank had raised Victoria as a single father after Margaret died of cancer when Victoria was 12 years old. Victoria Harmon had been an exemplary student who graduated valedictorian from Millfield High School in 2017. She had attended Portland State University on a full scholarship, earning a degree in environmental science before returning to Oregon to work for a conservation nonprofit. Victoria had inherited $400,000 from her grandmother's estate when she turned 23, money she used to purchase the isolated farmhouse on Riverside Road. The farmhouse sat on 47 acres of wooded land, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor and accessible only by a gravel road. Victoria had chosen the property specifically for its privacy and self-sufficiency, installing solar panels, a well water system, and organic gardens. The house had been converted to accommodate multiple adults, with additional bedrooms and common areas added to support the unconventional living arrangement. Frank Harmon began his final preparations on November 5, 2023, 3 days before the explosion. He had spent the previous week assembling the explosive device in his garage, using ammonium nitrate fertilizer, diesel fuel, and aluminum powder to create a bomb capable of leveling the entire farmhouse. The device was contained in a 50-gallon steel drum and weighed approximately 300 pounds. On the evening of November 7th, Frank loaded the bomb into his pickup truck and drove to the farmhouse under cover of darkness. He had been monitoring the residents' schedules for 2 weeks and knew that all 7 would be home that night. Security cameras he had installed secretly on the property confirmed that Victoria and her 6 partners had followed their usual routine of communal dinner and evening activities. Frank parked his truck in the woods behind the farmhouse at 11:30 p.m. and used wire cutters to disable the property's electrical system. The power outage shut down the security cameras and prevented any emergency communications from the house. He then carried the explosive device to the basement of the farmhouse, accessing the building through a storm cellar door that he had unlocked. During a previous surveillance visit, the bomb was placed directly beneath the main living area where the 7 residents typically gathered each evening. Frank had calculated the optimal placement to ensure the explosion would destroy the entire structure and eliminate any possibility of survival. He connected the detonator to a timer mechanism set to activate at 2:17 a.m., giving him time to reach a safe distance before the blast dot. Before leaving the property, Frank used zip ties to secure the doors and windows of the farmhouse from the outside, preventing any escape routes. He had brought bolt cutters to ensure that even if the residents discovered the bomb, they would be unable to flee the building. The methodical nature of these preparations showed that Frank intended to guarantee the deaths of all 7 residents. Frank positioned himself on a hillside overlooking the farmhouse, using binoculars to observe the building in the hours before the explosion. He had brought a folding chair, thermos of coffee, and a digital camera to document what he viewed as the execution of divine justice. His actions showed no signs of hesitation or second thoughts as he waited for the bomb to detonate. At 2:17 a.m., the explosion destroyed the farmhouse completely. The blast was equivalent to approximately 500 pounds of TNT, creating a fireball that rose 200 feet into the air and generating a shockwave that shattered windows in homes 2 miles away. The noise was heard across the entire county, with residents reporting that the ground shook like an earthquake. Frank remained at his observation post for 30 minutes after the explosion, photographing the destruction and flames. He then drove to the Millfield police station, where he surrendered to Night Desk Sergeant Tom Bradley at 3:15 a.m. Frank handed over the keys to his truck, admitted to causing the explosion, and requested that a lawyer be called immediately. Initial response to the explosion was complicated by the remote location and the complete destruction of the farmhouse. Fire departments from 3 counties responded to the blaze, but the building had been reduced to scattered debris and there was little left to save. Emergency responders focused on ensuring the fire did not spread to the surrounding forest. The crime scene investigation began at dawn on November 8th, with state police and federal ATF agents joining local law enforcement. The scale of the destruction made evidence collection extremely difficult, with body parts and personal belongings scattered across a wide area. Investigators used metal detectors and cadaver dogs to locate human remains and bomb components. Detective Maria Santos arrived at the scene at 6 a.m. and immediately recognized the complexity of the investigation. The complete destruction of the farmhouse meant that traditional crime scene analysis would be nearly impossible, requiring specialized techniques to reconstruct what had occurred. Santos coordinated with a TF explosive experts to analyze the blast pattern and determine the type of device used. The investigation began with Frank Harmon's confession, which provided a basic framework for understanding the crime. Frank had admitted to building and detonating the bomb, but investigators needed to verify his account and gather physical evidence to support the charges. His confession included detailed descriptions of his surveillance activities, bomb construction methods, and timeline of events leading to the explosion. Examination of Frank's garage revealed extensive evidence of bomb-making activities. Investigators found receipts for fertilizer, diesel fuel, and other explosive components purchased from hardware stores across 3 counties. The garage contained tools used in bomb construction, including drills, timers, and electrical components. Chemical residue tests confirmed that explosive materials had been mixed in the garage. Detective Santos discovered that Frank had been conducting surveillance on the farmhouse for 6 weeks prior to the explosion. He had installed hidden cameras on the property and had been photographing the residents' daily activities. The surveillance equipment contained hundreds of hours of footage showing Victoria and her 6 partners in various activities around the farmhouse. The investigation revealed that Frank had hired private investigator James Morrison to gather information about Victoria's living situation. Morrison had provided Frank with detailed reports about the polyamorous relationship, including photographs of all 7 residents and documentation of their unconventional lifestyle. The investigators' files showed that Frank had been obsessed with his daughter's choices and had been planning some form of intervention. Analysis of Frank's computer revealed extensive research into explosive devices and mass casualty attacks. His browser history showed searches for bomb-making instructions, surveillance techniques, and information about similar crimes. Frank had been methodically educating himself about the methods needed to carry out his attack, spending hours each day researching and planning. The investigation also uncovered Frank's financial preparations for the attack. He had withdrawn $15,000 from his savings account over the previous month, using cash to purchase materials and equipment for his surveillance and bomb-making activities. Bank records showed systematic withdrawals designed to avoid triggering reporting requirements. Detective Santos interviewed members of the Millfield community who had known Frank for years. Former colleagues described him as becoming increasingly isolated and bitter following his daughter's departure for college. Church members reported that Frank had been expressing extreme views about moral decay and the need for decisive action against what he viewed as societal corruption. The investigation revealed that Frank had been planning the attack since September 2023, when he first learned about Victoria's living arrangements. He had spent 2 months gathering intelligence, acquiring materials, and preparing the explosive device. His meticulous planning showed that the attack was not a crime of passion, but a carefully orchestrated execution. Evidence found in Frank's home included detailed floor plans of the farmhouse, schedules of the residents' activities, and photographs of potential escape routes. Frank had studied every aspect of the property to ensure his attack would be successful. He had also prepared contingency plans in case the primary explosive device failed to detonate. The investigation uncovered Frank's correspondence with extremist religious groups that promoted violence against individuals they viewed as morally corrupt. Frank had been participating in online forums where members discussed taking direct action against people whose lifestyles they found objectionable. These communications showed that Frank had been radicalized by exposure to extremist ideologies. Detective Santos discovered that Frank had been monitoring Victoria's social media accounts and had been tracking her relationships for over a year. He had compiled detailed dossiers on each of the 6 men living with Victoria, including their backgrounds, employment history, and personal relationships. Frank's obsession with his daughter's private life had consumed his entire existence. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Detective Santos discovered that Frank Harmon had not acted alone. Hidden cameras found in Frank's garage revealed that he had been meeting regularly with 3 other men from the Millfield community who had been helping him plan and finance the attack. The co-conspirators were identified as his brother-in-law Robert Chun, hardware store owner Dale Morrison, and church deacon William Torres. The conspiracy had been ongoing for 3 months, with the 4 men meeting weekly to discuss what they called moral cleansing of their community. Robert Chun had provided financial support for the attack, contributing $8,000 toward the purchase of materials and equipment. Dale Morrison had supplied explosive components through his hardware store, using false invoices to hide the transactions from investigators. William Torres had been recruiting additional members for their group through his position as a church deacon, identifying other community members who shared their extremist views. The group had been planning additional attacks against other residents they viewed as morally corrupt, including a same-sex couple who had recently moved to Millfield and a divorced woman who was living with her boyfriend. The most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered that the group had been poisoning the water supply of the farmhouse for 2 weeks before the explosion. Laboratory analysis of water samples revealed the presence of a slow-acting toxin that would have eventually killed all 7 residents, even without the bomb. The poisoning was intended as a backup plan in case the explosive device failed to detonate. Detective Santos found evidence that the conspiracy extended beyond Millfield, with connections to similar extremist groups in other rural communities across the Pacific Northwest. The groups had been coordinating their activities through encrypted messaging apps and had been sharing information about potential targets and attack methods. Frank's group was part of a larger network of domestic terrorists operating in small towns throughout the region. The investigation revealed that Victoria Harmon had been receiving death threats for 6 months before the explosion. The threats had been sent through untraceable email accounts and had described her lifestyle as an abomination that needed to be eliminated. Victoria had reported the threats to local police, but they had not been taken seriously due to the apparently random nature of the messages. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Frank had been planning to kill himself after the explosion, but had changed his mind at the last moment. Investigators found a suicide note in his truck, along with a loaded pistol and additional explosive devices. Frank had originally intended to die with his victims, but had decided to surrender to police in order to spread his extremist message through the court system. The investigation also revealed that the 6 men living with Victoria were not involved in a polyamorous relationship, but were actually members of a religious commune that practiced intentional community living. The group had been focused on sustainable agriculture and spiritual development, not the sexual degeneracy that Frank had imagined. His fundamental misunderstanding of their lifestyle had led to the murder of 7 innocent people. Detective Santos discovered that Frank had been suffering from untreated mental illness, including paranoid delusions and religious obsessions that had been escalating for years. Medical records showed that he had been prescribed antipsychotic medication in 2019, but had stopped taking it against medical advice. His deteriorating mental state had been exacerbated by his exposure to extremist ideologies and his isolation from mainstream society. The investigation revealed that several community members had been aware of Frank's extremist views and his potential for violence, but had failed to report their concerns to law enforcement. Church members had heard Frank making threatening statements about his daughter and had witnessed his increasingly erratic behavior, but had chosen to handle the situation internally rather than involving authorities. Frank Harmon and his 3 co-conspirators were arrested on November 15, 2023, and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, terrorism, and weapons violations. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, sought the death penalty for all 4 defendants based on the premeditated nature of the murders and the use of weapons of mass destruction. The trial began on April 8, 2024, with Frank's defense attorney Michael Roberts arguing that his client was mentally ill and had been manipulated by the other conspirators. Roberts presented expert testimony from psychiatrists who diagnosed Frank with paranoid schizophrenia and argued that his religious delusions had impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. The prosecution countered with evidence of Frank's extensive planning and coordination with the other conspirators, arguing that his actions were deliberate and calculated despite his mental illness. District Attorney Walsh presented the surveillance footage, bomb-making materials, and detailed planning documents found in Frank's home as evidence of his competence and criminal intent. The trial revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, with testimony from federal agents who had been investigating the extremist network for over a year. The prosecution presented evidence that the group had been planning multiple attacks and had been recruiting additional members from other communities. The case was described as one of the most significant domestic terrorism prosecutions in Oregon. History. Robert Chun, Dale Morrison, and William Torres each attempted to minimize their roles in the conspiracy, claiming they had been manipulated by Frank's charismatic leadership and had not fully understood the scope of his plans. However, the prosecution presented evidence showing that all three men had been active participants in planning and financing the attack. The trial lasted 12 weeks, with testimony from over 150 witnesses. The prosecution presented evidence of the defendants' extremist ideologies, their planning activities, and their coordination with other terrorist groups. They also presented victim impact statements from the families of the 7 people killed in the explosion. The defense struggled to explain the extensive evidence of premeditation and coordination among the defendants. While they successfully argued that Frank was mentally ill, they could not overcome the evidence, showing that he had been capable of complex planning and had been working with rational co-conspirators. The jury deliberated for 8 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for all 4 defendants. Frank Harmon was sentenced to death, while his 3 co-conspirators received life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge described the case as an act of domestic terrorism that shocked the conscience of the community and the nation. The trial also resulted in federal charges against 12 other members of the extremist network, leading to convictions in multiple states. The FBI identified the network as a significant domestic terrorism threat and implemented new surveillance measures to monitor similar groups. The case of Frank Harmon and the Millfield bombing exposed the dangerous intersection of mental illness, religious extremism, and domestic terrorism in rural American communities. Frank's transformation from a respected community member to a mass murderer demonstrated how individuals can be radicalized by extremist ideologies and how untreated mental illness can amplify the potential for violence. The investigation revealed that the conspiracy had been years in the making, with the defendants gradually radicalizing each other through their shared extremist beliefs. The case led to increased federal monitoring of domestic terrorism networks and new legislation targeting the use of explosive devices in hate crimes. The community of Millfield struggled to understand how 4 of their neighbors could have committed such a horrific act. The revelation that the attack had been planned by respected community members, including a church deacon and a town council member, shattered the town's sense of security and trust. Many residents moved away following the trial, and the town's population declined by over 15%. The case also highlighted the failure of community and religious leaders to recognize and address the warning signs of extremist radicalization. Several witnesses testified that they had been aware of Frank's increasingly violent rhetoric but had failed to take action. The case led to new training programs for community leaders on identifying and reporting potential domestic terrorism threats. The 7 victims of the bombing were remembered not for the misconceptions about their lifestyle that led to their deaths, but for their commitment to sustainable living and spiritual development. The intentional community they had created became a symbol of tolerance and acceptance, values that stood in stark contrast to the hatred and violence that destroyed their lives. The story of Frank Harmon serves as a warning about the dangers of extremist ideologies and the importance of mental health treatment in preventing violence. It demonstrates how ordinary people can become radicalized through exposure to hate groups, and how communities must remain vigilant against the threat of domestic terrorism. The case remains one of the most significant domestic terrorism prosecutions in Oregon history, illustrating the deadly consequences when mental illness, religious extremism, and access to weapons combine in a perfect storm of violence and hatred.